Hi, I'm Brock.
I'm Jim.
Before we get started, if you want to stay ahead of the cattle markets, sign up for our free daily briefing at hundredweight.com. It's delivered right to your inbox every morning, 5-minute read. And if you've ever wished you could keep complete cattle records without the clipboard, the Cattle Record Guide lets you enter records from the field with your gloves on. Just say, "Hey Siri, try it free for 14 days at hundredweight.com.
Welcome back to Cattle Market Guys. I'm Brock, and joining me as always is Jim. It's Friday, June 26, 2026, and we've got a full plate today. Market prices, futures volatility, a biosecurity threat that producers need to be watching closely, and some demand side news that could have real implications for where beef prices head the rest of the year. Let's get into it.
Let's do it.
All right, starting with our market snapshot. Looking at the numbers for the most recent week, lighter weight steers in the 500 to 549 pound range came in at $449.54 per hundredweight. That's on heavy volume with over 3,500 head sold. If you go back to the week of May 17th, that same class was trading at $463.31. So we've seen about $14 of softening over roughly a month. Now, that's not a cliff drop, but it is a consistent downward drift in the lighter weights. On the heavier end, 600 to 649 pound steers came in at $407.72 per hundredweight with over 5,100 head moving heavy volume. That class was at $424.64 back in mid-May. So again, roughly $17 lower over the past month. Futures on the front month are sitting at $360.82. And the next month out is $358.48. There is a meaningful spread between what cash markets are doing and where futures are priced, and that basis relationship is something producers really need to be paying close attention to right now. Jim, you watching that gap?
That basis gap's wide enough to drive a feed truck through.
That's exactly right. And looking ahead, our predictive models are forecasting some interesting moves. For the 600 to 649 pound class, the 1 week forecast comes in at $383.73 per hundredweight, stepping up to $411.01 at 2 weeks, then pulling back to $388.96 at 3 weeks, and settling around $371.42 at the 4 week mark. For the lighter 500 to 549 pound steers, the model shows $423.14 at 1 week, $431.71 at 2 weeks, $432.08 at 3 weeks, and then a more notable pullback to $405.71 at 4 weeks. What that tells me is there may be some short-term lift, but producers shouldn't get too excited. The 4-week horizon shows prices coming back off. If you've got cattle to move, the timing decision here actually matters.
4 weeks out, looks like the market's having second thoughts.
That's a fair read, Jim. And speaking of second thoughts, that brings us right into what's actually been driving this volatility in cattle futures this week. CME cattle futures went in two completely different directions in a span of just 2 trading days. On Monday, futures closed higher, driven by tight cattle supply confirmed in the prior week's cattle on feed report. The bullish fundamentals were front and center. Then Tuesday rolls around and futures closed lower on profit taking and investor concerns about whether American consumers will keep paying higher beef prices. Beef Magazine described the overall cattle on feed report as net neutral for the beef cattle complex. So it wasn't a bombshell in either direction, just a mixed set of signals. What that tells me is the futures market right now is genuinely caught between two competing forces, tight supply pushing prices higher and demand ceiling concerns pulling them back. When you're caught in that kind of tug of war, you get exactly the kind of 2-day whiplash we just saw.
That's the cattle market in a nutshell. One day it's the best business in the world. Next day you're wondering why you got into it.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing for producers who are positioned right. Tight supply is fundamentally supportive, and the cattle on feed numbers confirm that's real. The question is whether consumer demand holds up at these price levels. The takeaway for producers on the futures side is this. The bull case is intact from a supply standpoint, but demand risk is real, and that's why you're seeing profit-taking behavior from traders who'd rather bank gains than ride out the uncertainty. We'll dig into the demand picture in a few minutes because there's some news this week that speaks directly to it. But don't assume the supply story alone is enough to carry prices higher indefinitely. That's the risk right now. Now let's move to something that I think deserves serious attention from every producer, particularly anyone in the southern tier of the country, New World Screwworm. According to reporting from Cattle Range this week, confirmed screwworm detections increased by 4 new cases as of June 24th. That is an active, ongoing spread situation. The articles note that a brief lapse in control measures is all it takes for New World Screwworm to advance northward, and the current situation is described as illustrating exactly that dynamic. Beef Magazine also flagged the screwworm dashboard as one of multiple critical issues to monitor in 2026. Historically, back in the 1960s, screwworm cases were overwhelmingly concentrated in Texas, with 12 other states also experiencing infestations. That historical spread pattern tells us this pest has demonstrated the capacity to reach well beyond the border states when conditions allow. Jim, this one hits close to home for you, doesn't it?
It does, Brock. Back in '93, we got word that screwworm had turned up in a few animals down along the river country south of us. Most of the younger hands had never seen a case in their lives. USDA and Mexico had done such a good job with those sterile fly releases going back to the '60s that folks just stopped thinking about it. But my daddy used to tell me stories about losing calves to that stuff, how you had to check every wound, every brand cut, every newborn navel, every single day during warm months. When that report came through, I went straight to the barn and gave every one of my cattle a hard look. Turned out to be a small flare-up, got knocked back pretty quick. But it reminded me that a pest like that doesn't disappear forever. It just waits for somebody to let their guard down.
And that is exactly the lesson that applies right now in 2026. The article from Cattle Range puts it plainly. The never-ending battle against New World Screwworm requires ongoing vigilance and active control programs. 4 new confirmed detections in a single report cycle is not a number to brush past. If you are in Texas, the Southwest, or anywhere along the southern border regions, you should be checking every wound, every fresh cut, every newborn calf. The USDA monitoring dashboard is active, and producers need to be engaged with that. This is not an abstract biosecurity concern. It is real and current, and history tells us the cost of complacency is high.
Screwworm doesn't care how busy you are. It'll find that wound whether you check or not.
That's the one-liner producers need to tape to their barn door right now. All right, let's pivot to the demand side of the equation. And this one ties directly back to what we were talking about with futures volatility earlier. According to an article from the cattle site this week, recent food stamp cuts have stripped 4.7 million Americans of their benefits. Food pantry demand has hit record levels as states race to comply with those cuts. That is a significant contraction in purchasing power at the lower end of the income spectrum. And here's why cattle producers should care. The same article that reported on futures falling on Tuesday cited investor concerns over Americans' willingness to pay even higher beef prices as a key driver of that decline. These two data points are connected. When you reduce the food purchasing power of millions of households at the same time, beef prices are running at historically elevated levels. You create a demand ceiling. Lower income consumers don't simply absorb higher prices and they trade down to chicken, pork, or ground beef. And eventually some portion stops buying beef altogether at current price levels. Jim, you've seen this dynamic play out before.
Back in '96, when Congress passed that big welfare reform bill, I had a banker, smart old boy, who told me, Jim, when folks at the lower end of the income ladder tighten their belts, they trade down to chicken before they go hungry. And sure enough, we saw some demand pressure that fall. Prices didn't collapse, but that ceiling on what consumers would pay, it was real, and it was closer than some folks wanted to admit.
That's a pattern worth taking seriously right now because the scale of what we're looking at, 4.7 million people losing food assistance, is substantial. That's not a marginal adjustment. The record level food pantry demand being reported suggests the downstream effect on household grocery budgets is already happening. For cattle producers, the implication is that while tight supply is providing a floor under prices, the demand ceiling may be lower than current price levels suggest is comfortable. Traders in the futures market are already pricing in that concern, which is part of why we saw profit taking on Tuesday. Producers thinking about where to price cattle over the next 90 days need to weigh the supply story against this demand headwind. The market isn't going to collapse, but the old assumption that consumers will just keep absorbing higher beef prices without behavioral change, that assumption deserves a hard look given what we're seeing in the food assistance data.
The rancher's price starts at the consumer's wallet. When that wallet gets thin, the signal finds its way back to your sale barn sooner or later.
That's exactly right, Jim. So here's where we land this week. Cash prices for feeder steers have drifted lower over the past month, with futures sitting in the 360s and a notable basis gap that producers need to watch. The futures market is caught between tight supply fundamentals and demand ceiling concerns, which is producing short-term volatility. New World Screwworm detections are actively increasing, and the history of this pest demands ongoing producer vigilance. Check your cattle daily, no exceptions, and the combination of food assistance cuts and already elevated beef prices is creating real consumer affordability pressure that the futures market is already beginning to reflect. Stay informed, stay engaged with your marketing plan, and keep an eye on that Screwworm dashboard. We'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening to Cattle Market Guys.
Stay in the saddle, folks.
That's all for today. Remember to sign up for our free daily briefing at hundredweight.com. And if you want complete cattle records without the hassle, try the Cattle Record Guide free for 14 days. Enter records from the field with your gloves on. Just say, "Hey Siri."
Catch you in a couple days.
All right, see you then.